Jamie, this week, let's cover what Satya Nadella has actually talked about. He has written an essay, which is kind of like people found surprising. Not too surprising if you ask me, but he talked about the reverse information paradox for the age of AI and what that means, what the enterprises should do to avoid that information paradox. We'll talk a little bit more about what is it and what does he really mean by that.
And this is not code red, but this is GPT-Red. So OpenAI introduced an automated red teaming system that they use internally. We'll talk about that, as well as some interesting things that have happened with the use of GPT 5.6 Soul.
Things are getting tight for Google, and Europe has ordered Google to open Android and search data to rival AI assistants and search engines, which basically is an opportunity for lots of other players in the ground.
And implementation is all the rage when we talk about forward deployed engineering. And Anthropic and Blackstone have launched a company called Ode. I think that's the way to pronounce it. We'll talk about that.
Apple Intelligence won approval in China through Alibaba Quan and Baidu partnerships. They are showing basically how the local model strategy shapes the global AI rollout.
And in other news, not everybody loves data centers. So we'll talk about what New York State is doing as it relates to a moratorium on large data center buildouts.
OpenAI is actually on the roll. They are increasing their market share by actually rolling out to new platforms like AWS Bedrock. So AWS Bedrock now actually hosts the latest OpenAI model. That's part of the new agreement that OpenAI and Microsoft has agreed a couple of months ago.
And a little teaser, we'll talk about something called Codex Micro. So all that and more on this week's episode of the AI Files.
Stay tuned for a quick introduction. Greetings. Welcome to the AI Files podcast. If you're looking to stay up to date on the AI, this is the podcast for you. I'm Shadab Hussain. I'm the director of AI at Microsoft, and I'm your co-host.
Hello, everybody. Jamie Basilico, as you know already. I'm the other co-host here for the AI Files. My day job is a data and AI technical specialist and architect. And as a reminder, please note this is not an official Microsoft channel, so the views and opinions expressed by myself and Shadab are our own and do not represent the views of Microsoft.
So, Jimmy, let's talk about this week's code, which is from Satya Nadella's Sketchpad essay that he has written. Satya, who is the CEO of Microsoft, and he's talking about how this information paradox is changing for the age of AI. So let me put this first, right? What is the information paradox? So this was actually coined by Nobel Prize-winning economist Kenneth Arrow, and he talked about the paradox in the market for information. It is like this. The value for the purchaser of information is not known until he has the information. But then after seeing that information, he has in effect acquired it without cost. And that's what the information paradox is. This is established, this is somewhere in 1960s, Kenneth Arrow actually proposed this. And it actually led to a lot of changes because what it means is this, like, for example, you have a report, right? Let's say insightful report. And you say that, okay, I have a great insightful report. I say, okay, yeah. And you want to sell it. And I say, I don't know what it is. I don't know how valuable it is. I need to first see how valuable it is. And I see the report. And now I have the information, right? Now I say, I don't need to now do it, right? I've already seen what you have in it. And now I'm just going to use it. And I don't need to buy it, right? So this is what is the information paradox. So the value is not known until he has the purchaser has the information. But then, by the time he has information, he has already acquired it, right? It's so easy it's not a tangible material to exchange hands. That's information paradox. Now, what Satya Nadella is talking about is, and by the way, this information paradox was remarkable because this actually led to a lot of things. For example, non-disclosure agreements, right? Copyrights, patents, and all those things. A lot of these things started taking shape because of this information paradox and the theory around it and the impact and all those kind of things. A lot of that actually is scaled because of that, right? How do you protect that information? Because we were entering the information age. So now what Satya Nadella is talking about is the reverse information paradox, where he's saying that AI creates a reverse problem. In the AI age, the buyer risks giving away knowledge just in order to use what they bought. So, for example, if you are using the models from, let's say, Anthropic or OpenAI or any company, you're essentially paying for the intelligence twice. Once with the money, of course, And again, with something even more valuable, the proprietary knowledge that you must reveal to make that intelligence useful. The better you want the model to perform, the more of that knowledge you have to feed it. So if you're using the model, of course, you are giving away a lot of knowledge, right? In terms of your prompts are basically a feed, a knowledge feed, right? Your evals are basically telling it how to assess the output. So a lot of that is basically flowing in the model. And what he's saying is that this is the information asymmetry, which becomes increasingly skewed. The seller learns more and more about you as you use what you purchase, while you learn very little about what the seller is learning in return. If you're using the model from the frontier lab, right, of course you're passing a lot of prompts, and the seller, in this case the model company, is learning about your business, how you do the work. And you, however, don't really know much about it because it's a closed model. You can't really do anything inside it, right? I mean, you can only access the output. So that's what Satya Nadella is actually warning about. And he's saying that, in this age, patents solved one aspect of the arrows paradox, which is information paradox. Now, you need more of its equivalent for the reverse information paradox. In other words, a company should be able to use a model without giving up the knowledge that makes it unique. And that is a reverse information paradox we need to confront. And he's talking about that you can put actually some controls, you can do things, you can try to make that secure within the tenant, right? So the information is rather restricted. And I was thinking about this, Jamie, that it kind of makes sense because this is a line. Now, Satya is talking about it. This is what Palantir also talks about it. Now, on one hand, you can also very simply say that, hey, this is, of course, a biased concept because, of course, these companies are kind of losing out to Anthropic and OpenAI. So, obviously, they're going to talk about it, which is fair. I think which is fair, which is obviously the enterprises are always going to be biased, right? This is not a charity business. But I think there is a truth to that as well. Because if you see, Anthropic and OpenAI has been constantly launching so many plugins, right? And like for finance, for legal, and all those things. How are they even developing those, right? Obviously, they are getting access to some of that information. They are learning about how it is used. Somewhere that information is what is accessible to them, and they are making use of it, and that's how they're coming with all kind of these plugins. Otherwise, there's no way. It's not like they can just hire the entire industry and then develop that. I think this is very true, and this is something that enterprise need to look out for.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they'll say it's based upon information that they've gathered through, hiring individuals that have that industry expertise. But I would agree with you that, there's probably some amount of data gathering based on the prompts, the responses, looking at, the way that their systems are running the inference based upon your own corporate data, which is obviously not a good thing because you don't want your quote unquote trade secrets getting out. I think, at the heart of this, at least the way I think about it, is that companies need to be very aware of how and what they're using for these different models. Some organizations are more forthcoming around, and when I say organizations, I'm talking about like the frontier model orgs. They're more forthcoming, some more than not, on what actually gets done with their data. As an example, Microsoft says that any of your data, things that you do, are not used to train the models. And I think organizations really need to think about that as, they're on one end, they're paying for a service, the model, but they're also paying in another way, which is they're actually providing, thought leadership and intellectual property based on their own business processes and the things that they're unveiling to that frontier model. You're almost like paying twice because now you're giving that company potentially information that they can glean and gather to build new products, like you just mentioned. So, it again, this falls into this whole paradox scenario. So, anyway, my take on this is that as a company, you need to be very, very careful on what you're doing, how you're using these tools. And I think this actually opens up. I'm going to go out on a limb that based upon companies understanding more about how their data is used, that might actually force them or having them at least reconsider using open source models and them controlling their own destiny for using that. So that's kind of how I look at it. And that would be my recommendation to companies is think about who's getting your data and how can you protect and keep that in-house, especially the most important parts.
So, Jimmy, let me ask this question. I mean, it's inevitable that most of the companies are going to use the OpenAI or the Anthropic models nowadays, right? I mean, let's say 80% of them are using them. Your option as an enterprise could be that, okay, you can use some of the open source models and train them, fine tune them, and host them within your environment, right? That's one of the option because they're open source, they are not directly, and you can you can fine tune a lot of things, and you can host themselves, right? The thing is that the problem is that a lot of those open source models are not really actually that frontier anymore, right? I mean, Meta kind of lost out. They even shut down that whole Llama models and all those things. Um, so the choice is either you need to accept substandard models in order to do that, right? That's one option. The other is, let's say if you still want to use the Anthropic and OpenAI, would you recommend that, okay, rather than going directly to Anthropic and OpenAI, you should rather use them within the cloud platforms like Azure, because there is a tenant boundary and there is no information flow directly, and they cannot access. Does that give any safeguard if you use them in this way?
Yeah, no, that definitely does, and that was one of the things I was alluding to. Is something like Azure, or specifically the Foundry models through Azure itself, allows for this level of autonomy with the way that organization can use those models, and feels, I'm going to call it somewhat protected as it relates to the data boundaries and the ways that they're using those models. That's number one. The second part of it, I might disagree a little bit with you in the sense of these open source models. Yes, I totally agree. They may not be on the cutting edge or the frontier like a 5.6 or a Fable model as it exists today, but they're not that far behind. Meaning that if you go back 6 months, where were we with like something like Claude 4.6 or a GPT, 4.1, or maybe even I would say 5.1, right? That's the level of what's capable with today's open source models. Is that good enough? And I would probably say 80% of what you're doing might be totally fine for that. And I think this is where organizations really need to take a hard look at what they're trying to do, what's the business problem or challenge, and then find the right tool and the right quote unquote governance guardrails that would be acceptable for that opportunity. So I do think that there's more room than most people think for these open source models. And by the way, we're going to talk about a new open source model by Thinking Machines, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But these are things that are constantly evolving the open source to be, yeah, and again, I'll say it this way: is it good enough? I think that's what organizations need to think about. And again, I'll say it again here in this part: is good enough good for what your data boundaries and guardrails need to be? So anyway.
Mm. Yeah, interesting debate. There's a lot more nuances to it. There are a lot many things. But yeah, enterprises need to be careful. I do see many enterprises kind of rushing into it. They are very happy. They want to work directly with OpenAI and Anthropic, and they feel that, hey, they're getting the best and latest, but they're also training their own competitor.
Yeah.
And I can see that those very companies, those frontier labs, are actually launching the plugins and capabilities which are directly in competition to those same very customers who are working very closely with them. So it's a very very tough call for the enterprises to make. Um, anyway,
Agreed. So, moving on, talking about data and vulnerabilities, this is a good segue. So, OpenAI, obviously, they need to do a lot as it relates to understanding potential vulnerabilities within their own models. Let alone, I'm not talking about ways that a model could potentially break into some system, or find a vulnerability, let's say inside of Windows, right? So there's certain things that could be quote unquote broken in a large language model. I won't get into all the specifics. I mean, there's things like where it could jailbreak into a model that's like actually doing changing the behavior of the model based on the system instructions. We could talk about like prompt injections into the model. So all those different things. Those are potential vulnerabilities then within the model, and it kind of just goes hand in hand to what we just talked about. Like if organizations are now moving from just like doing simple chat and building agents and a whole bunch of different sub agents that have a lot of their business processes that are interconnected to tools that are connected back in to their back end data. and their most valuable data, like revenue or projection salary, you name it, that then becomes a vulnerability for organizations where that large language model is interwoven into a lot of those different processes. So part of this is how robust is a large language model in terms of securing itself. So this is something, this is not groundbreaking new thoughts or concepts. There's been this concept of red teaming. It's basically, how do I get security professionals to determine whether or not something is secured? So this concept's been around for quite a while. Also, the notion of doing model evaluations, like how well is my model behaving based upon either ground truth or expected results. You're evaluating how the model behaves. Well, you could do the same thing as it relates to the behavior of a model for discovering its potential vulnerabilities and just the overall robustness of that model. So the problem in doing that, however, is that that's somewhat complicated. It's hard. In some cases, it's not scalable. If you have the right methods, quote unquote, or things that you want to go after, it's how do I do that in a broad enough scale that it could cover something like a Fable model or a 5.6 Soul model, as an example. So there's been these, what I'm going to call, like, point evaluation tools and harnesses that all of the frontier firms have built. So that's not uncommon. But what was really needed was a way to develop methods that align with the desired safety, and then large scale alignment to aligning those safety principles to the model capabilities. So and where I'm getting at, this kind of culminated into a solution that OpenAI implemented. It's called GPT-Red. Now, don't go looking on on your favorite model provider to go find GPT-Red from OpenAI. It's not something that we can use. It's something that OpenAI uses internally. So this is a automated red teaming model that actually scales internally inside of OpenAI to find the vulnerabilities so that OpenAI can fix them before their wider deployment going out to you, me, and everybody else. So GPT Red is literally, think of it as like a human, but at massive scale to find these vulnerabilities. So what they did, and this is an interesting analogy. I've read a couple different papers and read through their article, but they built this GPT Red. Basically, they fine tuned a GPT-6 model to be a hacker. That's the easiest way to explain it. So they wanted to make sure that it could go into, like, a 5.6 Soul or Terra or Luna, or go into 5.5 or 5.1 or 4.1 to find these potential vulnerabilities. And what they did, and this is the part where I love, just based on the fact that I do martial arts, but what they did is use this basically like sparring back and forth between the GPT Red, which is, quote unquote, the adversarial red teaming one, and the actual, like, iteration of a model that, let's call it 5.6. So they had GPT Red basically attack 5.6, and then 5.6 would be, I'm paraphrasing this, but 5.6 would be like, oh, I'm getting hacked. How can I then change the way that the model behaves internally such that it's not vulnerable anymore to that type of attack? And this would go on back and forth between GPT Red and 5.6. What that actually meant is it's making that model more hardened to these types of attacks. So basically making it less accessible to being infiltrated by a prompt injection. So I showed a little metric over here. So they looked at a human being able to do this, quote unquote, vector-based attacking on a model versus what GPT-Red did. And basically the human baseline was 13% for what it would basically be able to call out to find within, let's say, a model. But GPT-Red was able to find 84%. I mean, this is like night and day between what one model versus a human, that, where that model was trained to be basically a hacker. So the outcome of this is that OpenAI now has a model that is much more solid, if I could use that term, where it's less likely to be hit with a prompt injection or you know, being able to be used in some nefarious way. So that's basically what GPT-Red is. So the bottom line is this is it's always going to be present where we think about what is the next safety battle. Like these frontier labs are always trying to build automated systems because attackers they're complex as well. They're always going to find ways of trying to circumnavigate into these different models, and that's something that GPT-Red actually does. So um, obviously I'd say kudos to OpenAI for building something like this. They're using AI to improve AI. That's the way I look at it.
Mm. Yeah, good system. Okay, in the next news, Europe is forcing Google to open Android and search to AI rivals. Of course, companies like Google and others like Apple, Microsoft, they all want to control their own distribution. Um, Now that creates unfair competition. So basically, European Union is asking Google, okay, give your rival AI assistant and search engines greater access to Android and Google search under the Digital Markets Act. What it means is that basically now the users can choose deeply integrated assistants such as ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, or other competitors instead of Gemini with comparable access to the device capabilities. So it requires Google to share data that could help rival search engines. Google is pushing back. They will try to appeal and all those things, but I think Europe is known for its stricter regulation around the competition, etc. So this obviously will help the other AI rivals. So overall, it's I think good news for the overall set of AI companies trying to provide better search and information retrieval capabilities.
Yeah, I think this is always interesting. It's obviously Google has an advantage. They collect a lot of data when you think about it. It's not only the data that they have as it relates to being able to do search, but they've got a huge, massive user base. Everything from people that are use Google for search to YouTube, the patterns that people do, and now with Gemini sitting on top of all that data, that's a
Mm.
huge benefit to any organization. I mean, you just think about what they can mine and what they can leverage to kind of sell back again to people. Kind of goes back to what we were just talking before about this information paradox. So, having regulatory bodies kind of force, Google in this case, but to make things at least level, I always think that that's fair business practice. It'll be interesting to see if this kind of trickles down into other markets or other geo areas. All right. So let's jump into something totally different. Talking about agent authority. So two interrelated stories. They're not exactly the same, but I kind of combined it in this case. So there is a company called 1Password. They have launched a browser integration for Claude, specifically if you're building agents. And obviously, you could take your pick on what models you use. But if you're using Anthropic to be either your agent orchestrator or running these subtasks, agents now can do things, right? They need tools. They need tools that potentially can get into systems. How do you get into systems other than making a connection? You need passwords. So this is an example where, if you have something like computer use and these things are going in, or that's just one example, but if you're making connections even into data systems, like how do they know what authority or authentication processes need to happen? So this is something where agents need that authorization. They need the authentication capability. So this is where if you have something that's doing stored login credentials and then giving identity to the various different agents, where the agents then act on behalf of that identity that they're given and then can use some credentials. Well, that's the whole intent. So this is the idea where a system grants access through biometric approval, injects credentials into a secure channel. That thing now is an agent, and that checks whether or not there's forms or submissions. These are things where those tools can now use those controls before it returns that information back to Claude. So this is basically a scoped credential use for these particular agents, where they think about, yes, what is my approval? What can I do in terms of my actions? And then whether or not those things need to be revoked over a period of time. The other flip side of this is where I talked about the identity. There is Mint Surf, that's actually a person. He is, he spent I think 20 years at Google. I think that was the company, but he's one of the thought leaders on security-based models and identity. Well, he's now working with a company, an organization called Innovation Labs. And Innovation Labs is working on basically a networking principle and authority for agent and being able to give identity to agents. It's basically a domain name infrastructure and crypto proofing for agents itself. Kind of go back to what I said before. Agents are going to need identity, just in the same way that people, like when I log on to my system, I have like a user ID within Entra. That's the same kind of concept, but bringing it to an abstract level where it's based upon this identity at a DNS level. So anyway, Vint is working with Innovation Labs to work on something called DNS ID. And again, that's a proposal, which is still in the works, to identify AI agents using domain name infrastructure. So this is where these two kind of come together. You've got agents with identity, and then you've got the ability for those agents to be able to take on work or tasks based upon its tools, based upon the credentials that they have. So you kind of see where those two come together. From an executive standpoint, this is where you start to think about, well, how do I start to combine enterprise grade identity and credentialing and accountability from an infrastructure to what these AI systems or tools need to do? And again, kind of goes back to what I said before. These AI agents are taking on more and more role within an organization, and you need that level of scrutiny. And in order to do that, you need some like tools to manage the passwords, who's got what. It's not just about users or humans anymore. It's about these agents, especially as I start to think about agents and a human interacting. So that's one way. From a technical perspective, as you start to build agents, you now need to start thinking about what does that mean from an identity. Is this something where I'm using OAuth, or am I using this DNS for machine-to-machine web activity? This is all about secure browsing. How are agents actually doing their work? So I would say, the big picture out of this is really about, this agentic web. It's going to fail without trusting the underlying plumbing. So you really need, the trusted plumbing, whether or not it's the identification or just passwords, the way these things are going to behave and interact with each other. That's the part. So architects need to think about these things as this evolves and develops even more. Because again, we're just scratching the surface of what organizations are going to do. Definitely feel this is going to be more and more important as we go along.
Okay, good stuff. Let's talk about enterprise AI's next business is implementation, not models. So the companies like Anthropic, OpenAI, of course, they do models, but I think everybody's realizing that hey, it is very important to make sure that those systems and applications being developed are actually done right, and they scale. In a lot of organizations do not have that capability right now. And that's why we heard about how Anthropic and Blackstone and others were coming together, creating a joint venture, which was basically focused on providing the AI engineers inside enterprises to develop, build, scale these applications. That company now has a name. It's called Ode. Ode is basically a form of a poetry which can be sung, actually. So no wonder Anthropic, which uses its name after the different forms of poetry, has chosen Ode. And this Ode has grown out of one of their own boutique company from Blackstone Group, Fractional AI, and they will use a Claude first, not Cloud, Claude first approach, while still using other models when necessary. So that's a model everybody's going after. And a lot of companies like Amazon announces something similar. And Microsoft also announced something very similar. Microsoft is calling it Microsoft Frontier Company, which will do about the same thing. It will have forward deployed engineers, it will have industry advisors, etc., all embedded, and make sure that the enterprises are able to build and scale these AI applications. So everybody is bracing up, forming their own joint ventures and partnerships and consortium to actually develop these kind of things. Because this is where the success lies. If you just provide model, you're not ensuring success. You got to make sure that the customers or the purchaser actually are able to do this, because most of them do not have that kind of capabilities.
Yeah, it's the three-letter acronym FDE is sort of like all the rage right now, the forward deployed engineering. So we're seeing companies like Ode and, as you mentioned, Microsoft Frontier Company, and you know, there just seems to be many different organizations that are focusing in on how do you bring the technical concepts or technical capabilities and people that know those technologies into these organizations that are trying to make sense of what is agentic AI actually mean. How do you line it with business practices? So we're seeing a lot of money and a lot of influx of revenue, or sorry, not revenue, but capital into these new companies that are starting, or just changing the way that some organizations have kind of structured what they think consulting actually is, or moving to it. All right. So let's go into the next one, which is really some rapid news. This will definitely be rapid. So Apple gets approval for its Apple Intelligence to launch in China, and this is after a deal to integrate with the Quen model into the operating system, both including the iOS, iPad, and Mac, and their Vision OS. So this is something that's confirmed that they're working with Apple on the Apple Intelligence features for Chinese users. So this is all about like global AI products becoming more local model products. Apple can't ship everything to every location with the same stack everywhere. I think there's going to be these local nuances as it relates to regulatory and domestic model use. And obviously China is a great example of that because of some of the things that you can or can't do within that market. So if you're in China or listening anywhere in China, they'll be coming to you shortly.
Okay, and New York is imposing a 1-year data center moratorium. Not a big deal because it's been happening a lot of places. A lot of states, a lot of countries are also even providing these kind of protection or resistance to the data center, because there is generally a backlash. In fact, that backlash is becoming quite organized now. There are actually companies or the consortium being formed to resist against the data center. One of the things is that because it disrupts the local ecosystem, right, in terms of the drinking water, the electricity becomes expensive, things like that. And the companies are responding by providing those kind of protection. The other thing is that in general, there is also a backlash developing against AI. And of course, data center is a host of AI. So there is generally it has become very touchy topic. You can expect a lot of, I would say, lobbying from the big tech companies about how the data center is actually helping the local communities, things like that. But it has become, and the reality is that data centers are necessary. Honestly, it's not just for AI, but it is also for lots of other things. I mean, a lot of companies depend on cloud, and cloud needs data centers. So I think there has to be a good way to be found where the local communities also benefit as well as the data center continues. Otherwise, we will continue to have these kind of supply problems already, which is in the market, right? It's hard to get capacity because of the lack of data centers. And with this moratorium, it just makes it harder.
This is going to be somewhat of a joke, but not really. We talked about the information paradox up front. This one is somewhat of a paradox. You've got groups that are organizing, doing protests against data centers. How are they organizing? They're actually using email, different quote unquote tools on the web to organize. So they're actually using data centers to organize against data centers. Anyway, yep. That's a paradox. So on to the next one. So this is kind of what I alluded to before. So thinking machines, if people don't remember, this is something that was a company that was formed by Mira Murati, who was the OpenAI CTO. So they released a model called Inkling, which is a 975 billion parameter model. It's actually a mixture of experts, with each individual mixture model being a 41 billion parameter or active parameter per task. So why that's important, it actually enables it to run on smaller machines. And if you're doing this in open weight, unless you have a supercomputer, you need something that can actually run this. This is something, again, it's an open weight model. The scenario around this is that thinking machines is actually positioning this for and or against the one size fits all, quote unquote, OpenAI, Anthropic, by giving organizations this ability to actually use these adaptable open weight models for themselves. And especially since I kind of mentioned already, that you want to think about what are those guardrails. Well, this allows you to put an open weight model on your own hardware to run it yourself. This is it was trained on text, image, audio, video, but currently it only outputs text and code and structured data. So who knows if they're going to get into video or imaging at some point in time, but it's focused on the core things that an LLM does. So be on the lookout. Try it out if you've got enough hardware to do it.
Awesome.
So, real quick, training data, Suno, it's there was something that exposed a hack on that. We'll kind of bypass that. I know we're running a little bit long today. Microsoft actually used AI, kind of go back to what I said about GPT-Red teaming. So this is something where Microsoft's, if you don't know, they do Patch Tuesdays. It's been happening for the last 2 decades. So in this most recent Patch Tuesday, the one for July, it actually fixed 570 different security flaws against multiple products, that being like Windows, Office, SharePoint, and other things. So Microsoft reportedly announced that it said that AI assisted the discovery and contributed to patching, if you will, those different vulnerabilities. And the note of this is that this is great. It's going to mean that there's going to be less potential vulnerabilities in the products. Microsoft also kind of warned that, hey, expect a bigger number per patch because of the use of AI. I think there will be a trailing, number of patches, but there's always new software that's being written, so it'll be high. But the general note of this is that the ability to find security flaws with AI helps to build the protective wall against those potential flaws in the first place. So everyone kind of focuses on, something like Mythos, that's going to open up all these vulnerabilities, and that it put in the bad hands, bad actors that can be, exploited. Well, the reverse is also true, that companies can use these tools to actually help harden those software packages or services that they've put out there in the market. And this is, again, one example of that. So this is really AI for good, where it can help solve some of these security woes. With that, let's jump into another real quick. There was a civil suit with XAI and a Bedrock user. It's really around some content for child safety. Just be aware of these things are out there. Bad actors will always do some bad things, but this is, again, a civil suit there. Let's get into real quick 2 launch things. So this is not necessarily a launch of GPT 5.6, but what is different is that AWS, for its AI platform, that being Bedrock, now has the Sol, Terra, and Luna on that. So it's not just about that they're making it available. It's about what AWS then brings around what I'm going to call the use of those models. Everything from like being part of their operational backbone, being able to be cost efficient, because they actually have things where you can think about the trade-off in terms of capability and capacity. They bring in enterprise grade security that makes it a differentiator. Everything from like isolation to cloud tail logging to data residency controls based upon where you're going to be using those. And again, that's based upon the regions. And then also additional caching that they bring into play. So yes, you get to use the models, but it's also about what AWS is bringing to the table. That I'll call it's their value add on top of the OpenAI models. So obviously, from a technical perspective, this is important. If you're a AWS developer, now you have the ability to tap into the latest and greatest frontier models from OpenAI.
Awesome. And there is a small, I would say, launch, not directly from OpenAI, but it's a kind of collaboration between the company Work Louder and OpenAI. It's a micro, you can say, a simple kind of a keypad, right? I mean, sometimes you have like a small keypad like this, which you keep as an accessory, where you can just simply push in some numbers, etc. And it's like that. This device is basically made for controlling agents, right? So it will have mechanical switches, actually. Some of them are, to be honest, just for pleasure. like the joystick. Okay?
Everybody likes buttons and blinking lights, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like there's this small joystick, okay, very small. I mean, like it's the size of that same kind of a button on a number pad. It's not like a huge joystick, and it has just like you can assign whichever directional key that you assign a particular function, and then you can play with it. Right, so it's more for a joy. There are actually colorful switches because they will tell you what the agent is doing, like inferring or thinking or executing or completed, things like that, right? So it's kind of like a RGB kind of status that flashes there. And it's like cool. I mean, as I'm saying, right, it's for those fans who like to collect these kinds of gadgets. Otherwise, it's not that it solves a huge problem in itself. And then there is even a dial. Actually, with the dial, you can actually change the thinking level of the agent, for example, right? So it's fun, and you can actually, there are caps, right? There are caps that you can exchange. You can assign a specific function to a particular key, and then you can replace it. Comes with like multiple kind of key caps that you can use actually. So it I would say, if I'm using a lot of agents, and we do use, but if you are using a lot of agents in Codex, right, this is specifically for Codex agents. So if you're using a lot, and if you have some money to spare, this is actually a fun device. Would like to keep a pad and play with it and feel good about it. I would say nothing like material benefit that comes out of it. That's something that you can't really do it, but it's a good, convenient gadget actually.
Sounds good. I'm starting to use Codex even more and more every day, so this might be a purchase on the near horizon for me.
I'm sure you will buy, Jimmy. You are. I know you
I
love
like,
you
I
love
like
these
the blinking
gadgets.
lights. So anyway, that is a wrap for today. So as we always say, thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and don't forget that not only do we have this on YouTube, but also on Spotify and other podcast listening. So wherever you're watching or listening, keep doing it, and tell your friends and family, and have more subscribers. So with that, till next time.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Jimmy.
See ya.
Bye.